Anything else? Any other problems solved using our forms that you
So
can think of off the top of your head?
maybe the last one I'll hit is the advisories. So if you're, well, I've talked to many attorneys who've, worked through a mediation or an arbitration process with a client. I've talked to a lot of attorneys at the E&O companies. One of the most important things that comes forward in any dispute where a real estate agent has been, accused by a client, for example, of professional negligence, is going to be evidence of how that agent had advised their client. And the buyer and seller advisories are tools that, one, help the buyer and seller understand all of the issues that they're going to face in a transaction and know where to get additional information and resources about those issues, whether it's inspections and the types of things that could come up, such as radon or an oil tank, or if it's zoning related issues, right? Those things are all described in the buyer and seller advisories. The other thing it does is provide that documentation that our members can use to demonstrate that they did in fact advise their client about important issues if there is a dispute in the future. So now I'm not saying that providing the written advisory means that you shouldn't also orally advise and do everything else you would. You should. But we've built these advisories into our forms process. So if you're using our listing agreement or our buyer representation agreement, the advisories are referenced and the client is acknowledging that they have received those advisories from you. When the client signs a sale agreement, the buyer and seller are acknowledging that they have received, read, and understand the buyer and seller advisory respectively. So we have several touch points here where those advisories come into play. Now, those should always be given out at the beginning of the relationship with the client, because some stuff in there isn't even just about like the sale agreement process, but stuff that will happen before that. So give it to your client, walk them through it, explain what it is. And then there are multiple points along the way where the buyer and seller are going to be reminded of that and acknowledge that they have in fact received and read and understood those. And we think that that is really good for the client and it's really good for the real estate agent as well.
With regard to the advisories, do you recommend that our members print them and deliver them to their clients, or is it intended to be a web-based doc?
You can use it either way. They can be printed, they can be used web-based. I think the most important thing is that they're given to your client in a format that they can use, right? So obviously, if you have a client that's not good with web-based materials, then you should print those out for your client. Yeah. So just make sure, and that should be part of your initial consultation with your client. And we've been talking about buyer representation agreements, but one of the most important things you can do as a real estate agent is sit down with your client at the beginning of the relationship when you're talking about that listing agreement or talking about that buyer rep agreement. Share with them these advisories and ask them that question, and maybe they want it in both formats and you're in a position to provide it to them, and remind them to keep referring to it. It's not a one and done. There's a lot in those documents. We're not expecting that a client sit down and read it cover to cover initially. What we want them to know is what types of things are in it and that they can keep going back to it as issues come up in the transaction so that they can get more information as they need it.
Yep. And that's where their expert they hired can help remind them to go to reference the advisory.